I'm Laura Bennett, 35 years old, and for most of my adult life, I believed I'd married into the kind of family people envy. My husband Ryan came from comfort and tradition, the sort of world where dinnerware matched the wallpaper and family gatherings looked like something out of a holiday catalog. I thought I'd finally found a place to belong. But that illusion began to unravel one summer afternoon when my 7-year-old daughter Sophie looked up at me with tears in her eyes and whispered, "Mommy, did I do something bad?" I can still feel how the air left my chest in that moment, how the sound of her small voice cracked something I didn't know was breakable. Before I go any further, tell me where you're listening from in the comments, and tap that like and subscribe button if you've ever watched someone you love be made to feel small when they deserved better. I grew up in a quiet town in Ohio where kindness mattered more than appearances. My parents worked hard. Mom was a teacher, Dad a mechanic, and they taught me that love was proven through action, not show. We didn't have much, but every birthday felt special. Every meal felt like gratitude in disguise. When I met Ryan in my 20s, his calm steadiness drew me in. He was the kind of man who fixed what was broken before it fell apart, the kind who kept promises even when they went unnoticed. We built a modest life together, a small 2-bedroom house, one reliable car, and a routine that felt simple but solid. Sophie came along a few years later, a whirlwind of joy with soft brown eyes and the sweetest laugh I've ever heard. She was the kind of child who said thank you for ice cream and hugged people twice, just in case they needed it. But every happiness has its shadow. For Ryan, that shadow was his mother. Margaret Bennett was a woman who commanded a room the moment she stepped in. She carried herself with the certainty of someone who had always been obeyed. Her house, the big white colonial at the edge of town, felt more like a stage than a home. The walls were lined with portraits of grandchildren, her legacy as she called them, each smiling in perfectly coordinated outfits. Every holiday, every special occasion, she gathered the family there, her kingdom, her rules, her spotlight. At first, I told myself her perfectionism was harmless. Maybe it was just her way of showing love. Maybe the constant comparisons were a habit, not an insult. I tried to believe that. I really did. The first few years of marriage, I stayed quiet, smiling through dinners that stretched too long, listening to her polished stories about which grandchild had made her proudest that month. Ryan would reach under the table, give my hand a small squeeze, his unspoken way of saying, "Don't react. It's not worth it." He'd learned that lesson early, growing up under her sharp eyes and sharper tongue. But silence carries a cost. The more I smiled, the more invisible I felt. And the more I watched, the more I saw how Sophie, so innocent and eager to please, was already learning that same lesson to wait for approval that might never come. When Margaret announced her latest family surprise, Sophie lit up. The invitation came on cream stationery with gold lettering calling it a celebration for all the grandchildren. Sophie talked about it for weeks. She thought it might be a treasure hunt, or maybe matching bracelets for everyone, something that made her feel like part of Grandma's club. I wanted to believe it too. I wanted to believe that this time maybe love would win out over pride. That morning the sky was bright, the kind of sunshine that makes you think everything will go right. Sophie wore her favorite yellow dress and carried her stuffed bunny, its ears worn soft from years of hugs. As we pulled into the long gravel driveway, she bounced in her seat, craning to see the balloons tied to the porch railings. "Do you think it's a puppy, Mommy?" she whispered. I smiled, pretending to believe in that magic right alongside her, though something in my gut told me otherwise. Inside the house gleamed. The dining table stretched nearly the length of the room, covered with trays of food and polished silver. Laughter floated through the air, cousins darting between adult cell phones recording every smile. Margaret stood near the fireplace, regal, in a lavender dress, holding court like always. Ryan's jaw was tight before she even spoke a word. He didn't have to say it. I could see it in his eyes. He'd been here before. He knew how quickly warmth could turn to coldness. And then it began. Margaret lifted a stack of small velvet boxes, each one glinting in the chandelier's glow. She called the children forward one by one. Each box opened to reveal a delicate gold bracelet, initials engraved, clasped around tiny wrists, while phones flashed and grandparents cooed. The room filled with cheers and polished smiles. Sophie sat a little taller beside me, Bunny in her lap, hope flickering like candlelight. She believed her turn was coming. But when Margaret reached the last box, her hand paused midair. Her eyes flicked toward Sophie, and her expression shifted just slightly enough for me to see it coming before she even spoke. "Oh, not you, sweetheart," she said, her tone light but sharp. "Maybe next time if you behave a little better." The room went still. The laughter thinned. Sophie's lips parted, trembling. "Did I do something bad?" she whispered, barely louder than a breath. Ryan didn't move. No one did. Cameras lowered. Children fidgeted. I could hear the chandelier hum above us like a living thing. My throat closed around every word I wanted to say. And in that frozen moment, my daughter clutching her stuffed bunny, her small face folding in confusion, I knew something had broken beyond repair. That was the day everything began to change. And though I didn't know it yet, the silence that followed would soon shatter louder than any words ever could. The sound of the chandelier still echoed in my mind long after that afternoon ended. For days I couldn't shake the picture of Sophie's small face, her lip trembling as she asked that question I'll never forget. But if that moment burned itself into my memory, it also peeled back the curtain on everything I had tried for years not to see. What happened that day wasn't a one-time cruelty. It was the clearest example yet of what had always lived beneath the surface in Ryan's family. Margaret had spent years building a world that looked picture-perfect from the outside, but on the inside it was built on silent hierarchies and unspoken rules about who belonged and who didn't. Every gathering followed a pattern that no one dared to name. Margaret chose the guests, the menu, even the seating. It was her show, and we were all expected to play our parts. Her house sat high on a small hill at the edge of town, the kind of place that drew attention from anyone who drove past. It looked grand, but every room carried her presence in a way that made it hard to breathe. You could tell which child was her favorite by the way her voice changed when she said their names, softening just slightly, like she'd found something worth her approval. I learned quickly that my job was to keep peace to smile when things stung, to make excuses for behavior that shouldn't have been excused. I used to tell myself that she didn't mean harm, that she simply didn't realize how her words landed. But that illusion faded a little more each year. By the time Sophie was born, I had already started recognizing the pattern, the way gifts, attention, even hugs were distributed like prizes. It was as though she believed affection had to be earned. Ryan tried to make it easier. He'd lean close during dinners and whisper, "Just let it go." His hand would brush mine under the table, that quiet plea to keep the peace. I used to wonder how he could stay so calm, but after that day with the bracelets, I started to understand. He had grown up this way. He knew what it was to sit in that same living room, waiting for a sign that he mattered. Margaret's approval was her currency. Her sons, their wives, the grandchildren, they all orbited around it, adjusting themselves to stay in her good favor. David, my brother-in-law, had mastered it. He always arrived early, complimented her cooking, made sure his kids said thank you in front of everyone. Janet, his wife, followed his lead with practiced grace, smiling when she needed to, never stepping out of line. They had 2 children, both of whom Margaret doted on endlessly. Every new school certificate found its way into a frame on her mantel. Every piano recital became a family event, recorded and replayed for applause. Sophie's drawings, meanwhile, ended up on our refrigerator at home, bright, uneven shapes full of joy that never earned a mention at Grandma's. She didn't seem to notice at first, but children notice everything eventually. That afternoon after the bracelet incident, I spent the evening comforting Sophie while Ryan sat in silence across the room. He didn't speak a word until long after she'd fallen asleep, her bunny tucked under her arm. When he finally looked at me, his face was pale and distant. "It's not new," he said quietly. "She used to do the same thing to me." He didn't elaborate, but I could tell from the way his voice caught that the wound hadn't faded with time. The next few days felt heavier than usual. Margaret called twice each time, leaving cheerful voicemails as though nothing had happened. "We missed you after the party," she said in that breezy tone she used when trying to rewrite history. Sophie must have been tired. "Tell her Grandma will make it up to her next time." I deleted the messages before Ryan could hear them. He didn't need another reminder. Work became my refuge. I buried myself in spreadsheets and deadlines, pretending normal life could smooth out what had broken. But every night when I came home, I'd see the way Sophie's laughter had dimmed. She stopped talking about Grandma's house. She started asking smaller questions like whether she could wear her school bracelet to bed or if she could give away the cupcake she'd saved from the party. Each one broke my heart a little more. Ryan tried to distract her. He built her a small bookshelf for her room, let her help him paint it pale blue. She giggled when she got paint on her nose, and for a moment it felt like things were right again. But the tension between us stayed. Every time I saw his mother's name flash on his phone, I could feel his whole body tense. A week later, Margaret invited us again for Sunday dinner this time. I wanted to refuse to draw a line once and for all, but Ryan said softly, "Let's just go. Maybe it'll be different." He said it the same way he'd always said it, half hope, half habit. So we went. The house looked the same, polished and waiting. The smell of roast chicken filled the air, mingling with the faint scent of her perfume. She greeted us with her usual practiced warmth, pressing a quick kiss to Sophie's forehead, as if that could erase what had happened. "Look who's here, my little sunshine," she said too brightly. Sophie stiffened, but didn't pull away. I could tell she didn't understand how to balance forgiveness with confusion. Dinner started quietly. The adults made small talk about work and school. Margaret bragged about David's promotion and Janet's new car. Ryan stayed mostly silent, eating slowly, nodding where politeness required. I watched him across the table, saw how his eyes stayed down whenever his mother spoke. Every now and then, she'd glance at him with that same mix of pride and disappointment that made no sense to anyone but her. When dessert came, she turned to Sophie. "You'll be extra good next time, won't you, sweetheart?" she said, smiling sweetly. "Then maybe Grandma will have something special for you." The words were sugar-coated, but the message was clear. Sophie looked at her plate silent. Ryan's hand tightened around his fork. I held my breath. But he didn't say anything, not yet. The rest of the meal blurred together. I remember laughter that didn't sound real compliments, exchanged like currency. When we left, Margaret hugged David's family first, lingering a moment longer with them before turning to us. Her smile didn't reach her eyes. In the car, the silence was thick. Sophie leaned her head against the window, watching the lights flicker past. "I was good today," she murmured softly. "Do you think Grandma saw?" I reached back, smoothing her hair, but my voice caught before I could answer. Ryan didn't speak at all. His eyes stayed on the road, his jaw locked. That night, after Sophie was asleep, he sat on the edge of our bed, shoulders hunched, staring at the floor. "I thought maybe she'd changed," he said barely above a whisper. "But she hasn't. She never will." His words hung heavy between us. I wanted to reach for him to ease that pain I could see written in every line of his face, but he stood before I could. "I'm tired of pretending," he said. "I've been doing it my whole life." Then he walked out of the room, leaving me alone with the quiet hum of the house and the feeling that something deep inside him had shifted for good. I didn't know it then, but that was the last time we would walk willingly into Margaret Bennett's house. What came next would turn that quiet resignation into something far more powerful, and it would start with Ryan finally finding his voice. The week after that dinner stretched longer than any I could remember. The air inside our home felt different, quieter, as though we were all holding our breath for something unnamed. Ryan kept busy with work, spending late nights at the kitchen table, reviewing blueprints while Sophie hovered close to me, quieter than usual. Her drawings changed, fewer bright colors, more small figures drawn in the corner of the page. Each evening I'd tape them to the fridge like I always did, pretending not to notice the difference. At work, I tried to keep my focus, but my mind wandered. Numbers blurred and small mistakes started slipping through my spreadsheets. My boss, Helen Carter, stopped by my desk one morning with her usual calm smile. She had that rare ability to see past polite answers. "You look like you've got a lot on your mind," she said softly, resting a hand on the back of my chair. I told her I was fine, that I was just tired. She nodded, not pressing, but before she walked away, she said something that stayed with me. "Whatever it is, don't let someone else decide how much peace you're allowed to have." Her words settled in my chest like a quiet echo. That night I watched Ryan pacing near the window, his reflection faint in the glass. He didn't say much anymore about his mother, but every time his phone buzzed, his whole body seemed to tense. The silence between us wasn't angry. It was heavy. I wanted to ask what he was thinking to reach across that invisible line between us, but he always gave the same small shake of his head when I tried. Sophie began dreading Sundays. "Are we going to Grandma's again?" She'd ask, her voice too light to be casual. I'd tell her no, not this time, and she'd nod relief flickering across her face. She never mentioned the bracelets again, but sometimes I'd find her holding that old stuffed bunny a little tighter, whispering to it like she was trying to explain something she couldn't say aloud. One evening after she'd gone to bed, Ryan spoke. His voice was low, almost uncertain. "I keep thinking about Dad's old watch," he said, staring at the dark window. "It's upstairs, you know. I've had it since the funeral." I turned to him surprised. He rarely spoke about his father. From what little he'd shared, their relationship had been complicated, built on quiet respect rather than warmth. "You've never mentioned it," I said gently. He shrugged. "Mom said it wasn't mine to keep, but Dad gave it to me anyway, right before he passed. He said, 'Hold on to this until you know who deserves it.'" He didn't say anything else, but I could tell that memory carried a weight far deeper than just the watch. It was the only thing of his father's he'd ever claimed for himself. I wanted to ask what he meant by "deserves it," but something in his expression told me it wasn't the right time. As days turned into weeks, invitations from Margaret kept arriving. Each one came in the same heavy cream envelope written in her neat cursive. Birthdays, dinners, a special Sunday brunch for the grandchildren. I ignored them at first, but Ryan always opened them reading each line before quietly setting them aside. He never threw them away. They piled up on the kitchen counter like reminders of a war he hadn't decided to fight yet. Then one morning he came home from work early, his face drawn. "She called me today," he said, pulling off his jacket. "She wants us at the next gathering. Says she has something special planned for the kids." I felt my stomach tighten. After what happened, I asked quietly. He nodded. "She said it'll be different this time." I wanted to refuse to tell him there was no reason to put Sophie through that again, but Ryan's voice had that familiar edge of exhaustion. "I need to see what she's planning," he said. "I can't keep wondering." His tone wasn't angry. It was resigned, the kind of tone that came from years of bending to someone else's will. The night before the gathering, I tucked Sophie into bed. She was quiet, but her eyes searched mine as if trying to read the truth before I spoke. "Do I have to go, Mommy?" she asked. I smoothed her hair back and whispered, "You don't have to do anything that hurts your heart." She thought about that for a long time before closing her eyes. The next afternoon, we drove to Margaret's house. The same long driveway, the same polished porch, the same carefully arranged cars lined up like soldiers. When we walked in, I could feel the tension ripple through the room before anyone said a word. The cousins were already there, laughing too loudly, showing off the bracelets they still wore. Margaret stood by the fireplace smiling as if nothing had ever gone wrong. "Laura, Ryan." "Sophie, so good to see you," she said, her tone clipped but pleasant. She bent down and brushed a kiss across Sophie's forehead. "You've grown so much, sweetheart." I could see Sophie's body stiffen, her small hands gripping her bunny. Margaret clapped her hands together. "All right, everyone. Let's gather in the living room. I have a surprise." The words were the same ones she'd used before, and I felt Ryan's fingers brush mine, a silent reassurance that he was watching, waiting. She disappeared into the next room and returned carrying another stack of small boxes, though these were wrapped in silver paper instead of velvet. The children's eyes widened, phones lifted again. It was all so rehearsed that it almost felt like a rerun of the last gathering. Margaret began handing out the gifts one by one, the room filled with the soft tier of paper and the sound of polite applause. Each child received a small silver pendant engraved with their initials. When she reached Sophie, her hand hesitated, but only for a heartbeat this time. Then she smiled and handed her a box. "This one's for you, darling," she said brightly, her voice almost exaggerated. Sophie's eyes flickered with surprise as she opened it. Inside was a pendant identical to the others. For a moment I thought maybe, just maybe, things had changed, but when Sophie lifted it out, the clasp snapped, the chain broken. A faint crack ran through the delicate metal near her initials. Margaret gasped dramatically, pressing a hand to her chest. "Oh dear, "Must have been damaged in shipping," she said. "I'll have it fixed eventually." The cousins fell silent, glancing between Sophie and their grandmother. The tension returned thick and sharp. Ryan's jaw tightened. I reached for Sophie's hand, but she was already retreating behind me, her face pale. "It's okay," she whispered. "I don't need it." The rest of the afternoon crawled by. Margaret moved on as though nothing had happened, laughing, serving cake, taking photos. Ryan stayed quiet, his expression unreadable. Every now and then his eyes drifted toward the staircase, the one that led to his father's old study upstairs. I didn't understand what he was planning, but I could tell he was done waiting. When we finally left, the sun was setting, casting long shadows across the porch. Sophie climbed into the back seat, still holding the broken chain. Ryan didn't start the car right away. He sat there staring out the windshield. "She hasn't changed," he said softly. "She never will." Then almost to himself he added, "But I will." I didn't ask what he meant. I didn't need to. Because in that quiet moment, I saw something new in him, something steady and unshakable. The years of silence were cracking, and whatever came next, I knew he wasn't going to hide behind it anymore. That night after the gathering, the broken pendant lay on the kitchen counter beside a cup of cold tea. Sophie had gone to bed early, curled up with her bunny, while Ryan sat across from me, the silence stretching between us. The only light came from the hallway, dim and golden, spilling over his shoulders as he rubbed his temples. He hadn't said much since we left his mother's house, but I could tell the weight of that day hadn't left him. Finally, he said quietly, "I can't keep letting her hurt Sophie." I waited. The sound of the refrigerator hum filled the space between us. Ryan looked up, then his eyes tired but focused. "It's the same thing she did to me," he said. "Only now I see it through Sophie's eyes." He stood and walked to the window, his reflection caught in the glass. "When I was a kid, I thought if I worked hard enough, if I stayed quiet enough, she'd finally see me. But she only ever saw what made her look good." The next morning he was up before dawn. I heard him moving around upstairs, drawers opening and closing. When I walked in, he was holding the wooden box I'd seen only once before, the one with his father's initials carved faintly on the lid. The box looked small in his hands, but the way he held it, I knew it meant more than anything he owned. "This was Dad's," he said simply. "He gave it to me the week before he died." He brushed the dust from the lid. I think I finally understand what he meant. I didn't ask what that was. I could tell by the look in his eyes that he'd already made up his mind about something. Instead, I sat with him while he opened the box. Inside, the gold watch gleamed faintly in the morning light, its surface still smooth after all those years. Ryan turned it over in his hand, tracing the engraving on the back. "He told me this belonged to the person who understood family," he said. "I used to think he meant Mom, but now I think he was trying to warn me." Later that week, Ryan called his brother. I was in the next room folding laundry when I heard his voice through the wall. He spoke calmly at first, but his tone hardened as the conversation went on. "You saw what she did," he said. "You can't keep pretending it's fine." There was a long pause, and then more quietly, "No, David, I'm not overreacting. I'm finally done ignoring it." When he hung up, his shoulders dropped like he'd been holding his breath for years. At work, I found myself distracted again. Helen noticed right away. She called me into her office and closed the door behind her. "You've been off lately," she said gently. "You don't have to tell me everything, but I can tell it's more than just work." I hesitated, then told her a little, just enough for her to understand that it was family. She nodded slowly, her expression thoughtful. "Sometimes," she said, "people hide behind the word family to excuse cruelty. But love doesn't work that way. Real love never asks you to shrink." That evening, Ryan was already home when I pulled into the driveway. The house smelled like coffee and sawdust. He'd been in the garage working on something. On the table sat the wooden box again this time, cleaned and polished. "What are you going to do?" I asked. He looked at me steady. "I'm going to bring it with me," he said, "to the next gathering." I didn't argue, but my stomach tightened. The next invitation came a few days later, Margaret's birthday dinner. The envelope was sealed with gold wax, as if formality could disguise manipulation. Ryan opened it, read the details, and nodded. "We'll go," he said, "but this time we're not walking in quiet." The day of the dinner felt heavier than the others. Sophie didn't ask questions, though she stayed close to me as we got ready. I dressed her in a simple blue dress she loved, the one with daisies stitched along the collar. Ryan tucked the watch into his jacket pocket before we left. He didn't say a word the whole drive. Margaret's house looked the same as always, perfect, polished, expectant. She met us at the door with her usual gracious smile, acting as though nothing unpleasant had ever happened between us. "Oh, good, you made it," she said, stepping aside. "We were just about to start." The dining room shimmered with candles and polished silver. David and Janet were already seated, their kids whispering and giggling at the end of the table. As dinner began, the conversation moved in predictable circles. David's job, Janet's charity work, the grandchildren's school awards. Margaret beamed through it all, occasionally touching the framed photo of her late husband that sat near her chair. Ryan stayed mostly silent, watching her with a calm I couldn't read. When dessert arrived, she tapped her glass for attention. Before we eat, she announced, "I want to thank everyone for making this such a lovely evening. It's wonderful to have my whole family here." Her whole family. The words lingered in the air, almost deliberate. Then turning to Sophie, she added with a too bright smile, "And I owe this little one a replacement for that necklace mishap. I'll have it fixed soon." The tone was light, almost mocking. Ryan's hand tightened on the table. He stood then slowly, as if something inside him had reached its limit. "You don't need to," he said evenly. Margaret blinked, surprised. "Excuse me?" He stepped back from his chair, one hand slipping into his jacket pocket. "You don't need to replace it," he repeated. "She doesn't need another gift from you." The room fell silent. Even the kids stopped whispering. Margaret's smile faltered. "Ryan, what are you talking about? Don't make a scene." He shook his head. "No scene, just truth." He placed the wooden box on the table, the sound echoing louder than it should have. "Do you remember Dad's watch?" Her face changed just for a second. "Of course," she said carefully. Why Ryan opened the box and lifted the watch, the gold catching the light. "He gave it to me before he died. Told me to pass it on when I knew who deserved it." His voice didn't waver. "And I do now." He turned toward Sophie, who was staring up at him wide-eyed. The entire table was frozen, no one daring to breathe. He knelt beside her chair and placed the watch gently in her small hands. "This is yours," he said softly, "because you do deserve it. Because you are part of this family, no matter what anyone else tries to say." The air in the room seemed to shift. Margaret's eyes widened, her painted smile slipping into something brittle. "Ryan," she began, her voice trembling. "That's not appropriate. It's a family heirloom." He stood, his voice steady. "Exactly. And that's why it's hers." No one moved. The golden face of the watch glinted in the candlelight as Sophie clutched it to her chest. The silence that followed felt like a lifetime compressed into a single breath. I looked around the table at the faces frozen between shock and understanding, and knew nothing in this family would ever look the same again. Ryan reached for my hand, squeezing it once before saying, "We're done pretending." And for the first time in years, I believed him. Outside, the night air was cold against my skin. Sophie held the watch tightly as we walked toward the car, her small steps quick to keep up with ours. The stars were faint above the hill, and behind us, the windows of Margaret's house glowed warm and distant. I didn't look back. That night, Ryan didn't speak much, but the tension that had lived in his shoulders for years was gone. Something inside him had shifted, something final. What I didn't know then was that the real fallout was only beginning, and before it was over, every truth he'd kept buried would come to light. The drive home from Margaret's birthday dinner was silent, except for the hum of the tires on the road. Sophie sat in the back seat, holding the gold watch with both hands, her head resting against the window. Ryan's eyes stayed fixed on the dark stretch ahead, the muscles in his jaw tight, his hands steady on the wheel. I kept glancing at him, waiting for some sign of what he was thinking, but he never looked over. The only light came from the passing street lamps flashing across his face in slow, quiet intervals. When we finally reached home, Sophie stirred, blinking sleepily. "Can I keep it next to my bed?" she asked, her small voice uncertain. Ryan turned around and nodded. "It's yours now," he said softly. "Take good care of it." She smiled, her eyes still heavy with sleep, and carried it upstairs like something precious. We watched her disappear down the hallway, the sound of her door clicking shut more final than I expected. Downstairs, Ryan sat at the kitchen table, his elbows on his knees, staring at the floor. The calm that had carried him through the evening was gone, replaced by something heavier. "I didn't plan that," he said, after a long pause. I just couldn't listen to her one more second. His voice was quiet, but it trembled at the edges. "I thought I'd be angry, but mostly I just feel tired." I poured him a cup of coffee, though he barely touched it. The clock on the wall ticked louder than usual. After a while he said, "You saw how they looked at us, like we ruined something." I shook my head. "You didn't ruin anything, Ryan. You told the truth." He didn't answer, but I could see the weight of years settling on his shoulders, years of swallowing words, of staying small so peace could survive. The next few days passed in fragments. Margaret didn't call, but she didn't have to. The silence spoke for her. David reached out once, a short message on Ryan's phone that said, "Mom's upset. You went too far." Ryan read it, sighed, and set the phone face down on the counter. He didn't reply. At work, I tried to carry on as usual. Helen stopped by my desk one afternoon and asked how things were at home. I hesitated before telling her, "It's like everything finally cracked open." She nodded knowingly. "Cracks let the light in," she said, "but they also show you what was underneath." That night, her words echoed in my head as I watched Ryan sitting by Sophie's bed, helping her wind the gold watch before she fell asleep. For a while, life settled into a strange kind of quiet. Margaret stayed away, and Ryan didn't chase contact. Sophie seemed lighter, though. Sometimes she asked questions I didn't know how to answer. Why did Grandma look mad when Daddy gave me the watch, she'd ask. I'd smooth her hair and tell her that sometimes grown-ups forget what's really important. It was the gentlest truth I could manage, but beneath that quiet, something was shifting. Ryan started spending more time in the garage, sorting through old boxes from his father's things. I'd find him sitting on a stool, surrounded by old tools, photo albums, and yellowed papers. One night, he came inside holding a faded photograph, him and his father standing side by side, Ryan, maybe 10 years old, both of them smiling with the same crooked grin. "He gave me that watch the day this was taken," Ryan said quietly. "She told me it wasn't mine, said I was too young, that David should have it one day. But Dad told me not to listen." He placed the photo on the table, tracing his father's face with his thumb. "I think he knew what she was like. He just didn't know how to stop her." A few nights later, Ryan got another message, this time from Janet. "Mom wants to talk. She says she's ready to apologize." He read it out loud but didn't look convinced. "Do you think she means it?" I asked. He didn't answer right away. "No," he said finally. "But maybe it's time she heard me anyway." When he told Sophie that Grandma wanted to see her, she hesitated. "Will she be nice this time?" Ryan knelt down beside her. "You don't have to see her if you don't want to," he said. Sophie thought for a moment, then shook her head. "I'll stay home with Mommy." Ryan nodded. "That's fine." The next evening, Ryan drove to his mother's house alone. The sky was gray rain threatening in the distance. I watched from the window until his truck disappeared down the road. The house felt unusually still without him. Sophie sat at the table, drawing pictures of flowers, her tongue poking out in concentration. "Daddy's brave," she said suddenly without looking up. I smiled softly. "He is." It was nearly 2 hours before I heard the sound of his truck pulling back into the driveway. I met him at the door. He looked worn out, but calmer somehow. "How did it go?" I asked. He set his keys down and exhaled. "She tried to act like nothing happened," he said. "Tried to tell me I embarrassed her, but I told her I wasn't ashamed of anything I said." He paused, shaking his head. "She cried for a minute, said she never meant to hurt me. Then she told me I was ungrateful. I think she wanted to rewrite the story before anyone else could." He poured himself a glass of water and leaned against the counter. "I didn't yell," he added. "I just told her it ends here. No more pretending, no more picking favorites. She said she didn't understand what I meant. I told her she didn't have to. She just had to stop." That night he fell asleep early, the first deep sleep I'd seen him get in months. When I checked on Sophie, she was still awake, whispering to her stuffed bunny. "Daddy's not sad anymore," she murmured, her voice soft. I kissed her forehead and told her good night. The next morning, Ryan called David. I overheard part of the conversation from the hallway. "I didn't do it to embarrass her," he said. "I did it because someone had to." He paused, listening, then said quietly, "You were the golden one, Dave. You never saw what it was like on the other side." When he hung up, his expression was complicated. Not angry, not relieved, just settled. "He won't get it," he said. "He's still under her thumb." The following weekend, Sophie wore the watch to a friend's birthday party. When one of the other parents complimented it, she smiled proudly and said, "It was my grandpa's. Daddy said it's for people who understand family." I felt my throat tighten at her words. It wasn't just jewelry to her, it was proof she belonged. Later that night, as I tucked her in, she looked up at me with that same bright curiosity. "Do you think Grandma's still mad?" she asked. I hesitated. "Maybe," I said. "But Daddy's not afraid of that anymore." She nodded, satisfied with that answer, and closed her eyes. Downstairs, Ryan sat at the kitchen table again, the wooden box beside him now empty. "She won't change," he said quietly, not looking up. "But maybe that's not the point anymore." He took my hand, his thumb tracing slow circles against my skin. "I just want Sophie to know love doesn't have to come with strings." The house was quiet except for the sound of the clock on the wall. Outside, the rain had started steady and soft. Ryan reached for my hand again. "Next time," he said, "I won't wait for her to start something. I'll decide how it ends." His voice was calm, certain. I didn't know what he meant yet, but I could tell that whatever came next, it wouldn't be silence. The week after Ryan's visit to his mother's house passed in uneasy quiet. For the first time in years, the phone stayed silent. No invitations, no guilt-laced voicemails, no carefully worded messages about keeping the family together. It was strange, peaceful but heavy too, like the pause before a storm. Ryan spent more evenings at home sitting with Sophie as she did her homework, helping her practice spelling words while I cooked dinner. Every now and then I'd catch him watching her with that quiet pride that had replaced his old tension. But silence has a way of drawing attention. The absence of Margaret's presence felt almost louder than her voice. One Saturday morning, while Ryan was mowing the lawn, an envelope showed up in our mailbox. The handwriting on the front was unmistakable, his mother's careful script deliberate and neat. Ryan opened it on the porch without a word. Inside was a short note, "Family dinner. This Sunday. Everyone's invited." Beneath it, a single sentence stood alone. "Let's put the past behind us." He folded the paper in half and stared at it for a long moment. "What do you think?" I asked quietly. He shook his head. "It's not about peace," he said. "It's about control. But I need to face her one last time." That Sunday, the air was cold and gray. Sophie stayed home with a babysitter while we drove. Neither of us spoke much on the way there. The tires made a steady rhythm against the road, like a ticking clock counting down to something inevitable. When Margaret's house came into view, its white siding gleaming against the overcast sky, I felt that familiar knot tighten in my chest. Inside the house looked as perfect as ever, silver-polished floors, gleaming, the scent of lemon cleaner hanging in the air. David and Janet were already there, sitting stiffly at the table. Their children played quietly in the next room, laughter echoing faintly through the walls. Margaret greeted us at the door with a bright smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Ryan," she said. Leaning in for a hug, he didn't return. "I'm glad you came." Dinner started with forced pleasantries. Margaret asked about Ryan's work, complimented my blouse, praised her grandsons for their school achievements. She was careful, too. Careful. Every sentence sounded rehearsed. It wasn't until the plates were cleared and the coffee was poured that the real conversation began. Margaret folded her hands on the table, her voice measured. "I've been thinking about what happened," she began. "I realize emotions ran high. I never meant for anyone to feel left out." Her tone was calm, almost maternal, but her eyes flickered toward me, then to Ryan. "You have to understand, traditions are important to this family. They keep us connected." Ryan leaned back slightly, his jaw tight. "Tradition isn't the problem," he said. "The problem is how you use it." Margaret's smile faltered. "I was only trying to honor the family," she replied. "Your father would have wanted that." Ryan shook his head. Dad would have wanted respect. For everyone. He gave me that watch because he saw what you refused to. The room went quiet. David cleared his throat, trying to break the tension. Maybe we can just move on, he said, glancing between them. It's been enough drama already. But Ryan didn't look away from his mother. You've spent your whole life picking favorites, Mom. You think it makes you powerful. But it's just left scars. Margaret's eyes glistened, whether from emotion or anger I couldn't tell. You think you know everything, she said sharply. You don't understand what it was like after your father died. I held this family together by myself. Her voice cracked, but there was no warmth in it, just wounded pride. I had to make hard choices. Ryan's tone softened, but his words didn't. You didn't hold us together. You held us down. The words landed like a quiet blow. Janet shifted uncomfortably, her gaze darting toward David, who stayed silent. For a long moment, no one spoke. Then Margaret pushed back from the table, standing abruptly. I've done nothing but love this family, she said, her voice trembling. If you can't see that, I don't know what else to say. Ryan stood too calm but unyielding. You can start by saying you're sorry to the child you made feel like she didn't belong. Margaret's face hardened. She's 7 years old, she snapped. She'll forget. Children move on. Ryan's voice rose, not loud but firm, every word deliberate. I didn't forget. I was her once. I remember every time you looked past me to praise someone else. I remember sitting in that same chair waiting for you to notice I existed. The words seemed to strip the air from the room. Margaret's mouth opened, but no sound came out. Her hands trembled as she sank back into her chair. I thought I was being fair, she whispered. Ryan's eyes softened for a moment, but his voice stayed steady. You confused fairness with control. They're not the same thing. For the first time, I saw something shift in her expression. Not guilt exactly, but the faint realization that the power she'd clung to all her life was slipping away. David finally spoke, his voice quieter than I'd ever heard it. Mom, he said slowly, you really hurt them. You hurt all of us in different ways. Janet nodded, her voice tentative. It wasn't just about Sophie. It's been this way for years. Margaret looked between them, her lips parting like she couldn't believe what she was hearing. So now you're all against me? She asked, her voice small. No one answered. The silence that followed was louder than any argument could have been. Ryan sighed, the anger fading into something more tired, more final. No one's against you, Mom, he said. We just can't keep pretending. You've built a family where love feels conditional. That ends with me. He turned to leave and I followed, pausing only to glance back once. Margaret sat still at the table, her hands folded tightly together, eyes fixed on nothing. David looked torn, his expression unreadable. Janet reached across the table, resting her hand over Margaret's, but she didn't move. Outside, the evening air felt cool and sharp. Ryan didn't speak until we reached the car. That's it, he said quietly, almost to himself. She can choose to change or not, but I'm done living by her rules. He started the engine, the headlights cutting through the dark driveway. As we pulled away, I looked out the window at the house, still perfect, still glowing, but smaller somehow. Inside, I imagined the echoes of what had been said lingering in the air, heavy and unspoken. On the ride home, neither of us said much. Sophie was asleep when we got back, the watch still resting on her nightstand. Ryan stood beside her bed for a moment, brushing a strand of hair from her forehead. She'll never feel that kind of pain, he said softly. I knotted my chest tight. You made sure of it. He smiled faintly, but there was sadness in it too. I just wish it hadn't taken so long. Later, as we sat together in the quiet living room, the rain began to fall outside, slow, steady cleansing. For the first time, the silence between us didn't feel heavy. It felt like healing. Still deep down, I knew this wasn't over. Margaret had built her life around control, and letting go wouldn't come easily. The next step wouldn't be about confrontation. It would be about what came after, about the moment when truth meets consequence. The morning after that difficult dinner, the house felt lighter. The air didn't carry the same tension it used to. For the first time in years, Ryan seemed at peace. He moved slower, spoke softer, almost as if he'd finally laid something down that he'd carried for too long. Sophie noticed it too. Daddy smiles more now, she said one evening while helping me dry the dishes. I looked toward the living room where he sat reading, his posture, relaxed, his shoulders no longer weighed down by invisible chains. She was right. A week later, something unexpected happened. Margaret called. Not a text or a letter, an actual phone call. Ryan stared at the screen for a long time before answering. I stood nearby, quietly folding laundry, listening to the pauses stretch between her words. "I want to see Sophie," she said finally, her tone cautious. "I want to make things right." Ryan didn't respond right away. He just breathed slow and even. "If you mean that," he said, "then you come here, to our home." She hesitated before agreeing. They settled on Sunday afternoon. When he hung up, the silence that followed was thick. "Are you sure?" I asked softly. He nodded. "It's time," he said. "But it's going to be on our terms this time." Sunday arrived with steady rain, the kind that softens everything it touches. The house smelled like coffee and lemon candles, the kind Sophie loved. She helped me set out cookies on a plate, her excitement mixed with something uncertain. "Do I have to hug her?" she asked quietly. I knelt beside her and brushed a loose strand of hair behind her ear. "You don't have to do anything you don't want to," I said. She nodded, gripping her stuffed bunny a little tighter. When Margaret's car pulled into the driveway, I saw Ryan straighten. He met her at the door before she could knock. She stood on the porch, umbrella in one hand, her eyes flicking past him toward the warm light inside. "You look well," she said, her voice brittle. "Can I come in?" He stepped aside without a word. She entered slowly, glancing around the house like it was foreign territory. Sophie peeked from the hallway, but didn't move closer. Margaret noticed her and smiled, but it didn't quite reach her eyes. "Hello, sweetheart," she said gently. "I've missed you." Sophie didn't answer. She just looked up at Ryan, waiting for a cue. He crouched down beside her. "It's okay," he said quietly. "You can say hello if you want." Sophie nodded, her voice barely above a whisper. "Hi, Grandma." Then she turned and walked back to her room, clutching her bunny. Margaret's smile faltered. "She's still upset," she said softly. Ryan folded his arms. "She's learning to protect herself. I think that's a good thing." Margaret sank onto the edge of the couch, looking older than I'd ever seen her. The confidence she once wore like armor had cracked. "Ryan," she began, "I never meant to hurt you. Or her. I thought I was doing what was right for this family." Her eyes filled with tears that didn't fall. "After your father passed, I didn't know how to keep everyone together. I thought if I showed strength, if I set high standards, it would make people proud to belong." Ryan's voice was steady but firm. "You didn't set standards, Mom. You set conditions." He sat across from her, hands clasped. "Love isn't something you earn. It's something you give." Margaret's lip trembled. "I was trying to make you all strong," she said quietly. "I didn't realize I was breaking you instead." She looked toward the hallway where Sophie's door was still cracked open. I saw her face that night. I haven't stopped thinking about it. For a moment, no one spoke. The only sound was the rain against the windows. Then Ryan said something I never expected him to. "I forgive you," he said. "But forgiveness doesn't mean forgetting. It means I'm not letting it control me anymore." Margaret looked up sharply. "You forgive me?" He nodded. "I do. But things will be different now. You'll treat Sophie the way she deserves to be treated, or you won't see her again. No more second chances after this." Her shoulders sagged, the fight finally leaving her. "I understand," she whispered. "I just want a chance to do better." Ryan nodded once. "Then start with her." Margaret stood and hesitated at the hallway entrance. Sophie peeked out, her bunny tucked under her chin. Margaret knelt down, her voice quiet but clear. "Sophie, Grandma was wrong. I shouldn't have made you feel like you did something bad. You didn't. You're a wonderful little girl." Sophie looked uncertain for a moment, then stepped forward slowly. "Daddy says love doesn't have rules," she said softly. Margaret smiled faintly. "He's right." Sophie's small arms wrapped around her grandmother's neck, and for a brief second, the tension that had defined this family seemed to melt away. After Margaret left the house, felt calm again. Ryan stood by the window watching her car disappear down the street. "Do you think she'll change?" I asked. He sighed, his voice quiet. "I don't know. but I think she heard me this time. The next week, something remarkable happened. Margaret called not to invite us anywhere or announce a gathering, but just to talk. She asked about Sophie's school, about Ryan's projects at work, even about my job. Her voice sounded softer, unsure, but sincere. It wasn't perfect, but it was something. When Sophie's birthday came 2 weeks later, a small package arrived on our doorstep. Inside was a delicate silver bracelet with her initials engraved. But this time there was no show, no audience, no conditions. Just a small card that read, "You're loved, always." "Grandma?" Sophie beamed when she saw it. She remembered, she said. Ryan watched her slip the bracelet on, his expression a mix of surprise and quiet pride. "Maybe she's learning," he said. I smiled. "Maybe we all are." That evening, as we sat together on the porch, the sunset cast a golden glow across the yard. Sophie played in the grass, holding her bunny in one hand and her new bracelet glinting in the other. Ryan turned to me, his voice low. "I used to think strength meant staying quiet," he said. "Now I know it means speaking up even when it costs you something." The moment lingered between us, warm and still. For the first time in a long time, the air around us felt unburdened. We had come full circle, not through anger, but through truth. Still, somewhere deep down, I sensed this story wasn't quite finished. Healing had begun, but peace has a way of testing itself. And soon enough, life would offer its proof. The following spring came quietly, the kind that slipped in without fanfare. The air carried that soft scent of rain and new beginnings. Life had found its rhythm again, steady, gentle, unforced. Sophie was thriving, curious, and bright, her laughter filling every corner of the house. Ryan seemed lighter, his shoulders no longer carrying the invisible weight of old memories. And me, I'd stopped waiting for the other shoe to drop. It felt like the ground beneath us had finally settled. Margaret called often now, not out of obligation, but out of genuine effort. Her tone was different, quieter, humble in ways I never thought I'd hear. Sometimes she'd ask about Sophie's school projects or the garden we'd started in the backyard. Once she even sent over a pie with a note that simply said, "Thank you for letting me try again." Ryan read it twice before folding it neatly and tucking it away in a drawer. I knew it wasn't forgiveness she wanted. It was a chance to keep showing up one small act at a time. When Sophie's school held a grandparents' day, that May, Margaret showed up early. She wore a soft blue sweater and carried a single daisy in her hand, the same kind Sophie had planted in our garden. I watched from the back of the classroom as Sophie introduced her to her friends, her voice clear and proud. "This is my grandma," she said. "She gave me this bracelet, and she says it means I'm loved." The look on Margaret's face said everything. Her eyes shimmered not with pride, but with something gentler recognition. Afterward, we all went out for ice cream. Margaret told stories about Ryan as a boy, ones I'd never heard before. How he used to line up his toy trucks perfectly. How he once built a small birdhouse with his father that still hung on the porch. For the first time, her memories felt shared, not guarded. Ryan listened, smiling quietly, and when she reached for Sophie's hand across the table, he didn't pull away. He just let it be. That evening, as the sun set behind the trees, Ryan and I sat on the porch, watching Sophie chase fireflies across the yard. The golden watch still sat on her nightstand, ticking softly every night, a reminder of where this all began. "Do you ever think about how far we've come?" I asked. Ryan leaned back, the faintest smile on his lips. "Every day," he said. "I used to think breaking the cycle meant cutting ties. Turns out it just meant telling the truth and standing by it." His words lingered with me long after. I thought about how justice, in its truest form, doesn't always look like a fight. Sometimes it's quieter, like a boundary set, a truth spoken, or a child who grows up knowing she's safe to be herself. The hurt didn't disappear overnight, but it lost its power. And in its place came something softer, understanding, maybe even grace. The night air was warm, filled with the sound of crickets and the faint laughter of our daughter. Ryan reached for my hand, his fingers lacing through mine. "We did it," he said simply. I smiled, knowing exactly what he meant. We hadn't just built a life together, we'd rebuilt a family. As the porch light flickered and Sophie ran toward us, her laughter echoing through the yard, I realized that healing doesn't come with grand gestures. It comes in moments like this, the quiet kind, where love finally speaks louder than pain. If you've ever had to stand your ground for someone you love, I hope you know this truth. Breaking a pattern isn't about revenge, it's about freedom. And sometimes the most powerful thing you can say is simply enough. Thank you for listening to our story. If it touched your heart, share it with someone who might need a little reminder that change, real change, begins the moment we decide to stop repeating what broke us.